Josephine Tanner never expected her act of mercy toward a dying elk would lead to eagle feathers appearing at her fence like promises from another world. But sometimes the frontier rewards kindness in ways that change everything you thought you knew about the land and the people who truly belong to it. The Wyoming Territory stretched endlessly beyond Josie's small homestead, a tapestry of golden grassland and distant purple mountains that had been her only companions for the better part of 3 years. She had built her life here deliberately, choosing isolation over the suffocating expectations of civilized society back in Pennsylvania. Her late husband's life insurance money had bought her this 160 acres of raw frontier land, and she had carved out an existence that was hard but honest, raising chickens and growing what vegetables the harsh climate would allow. That crisp September morning started like any other, with Josie stepping out of her modest log lodge to tend the animals and check her vegetable patch. The air carried the bite of approaching winter, and she pulled her woolen shawl tighter as she walked toward the chicken coop behind the main building. The hens were already clucking impatiently for their morning feed, but something else caught her attention before she reached them. Blood. Dark droplets leading from the edge of her property toward the dense stand of aspen trees that marked the boundary between her homestead and the vast wilderness beyond. At first, she thought it might be from a wounded deer, perhaps caught by wolves during the night, but as she followed the trail, her breath caught in her throat. There, collapsed beneath the golden canopy of autumn leaves, lay the largest elk she had ever seen. The magnificent bull was breathing in shallow, labored gasps, his once proud antlers now partially broken, tangled with dried brush and strips of what looked like rope. His dark eyes, usually alert and wild, were glazed with pain and exhaustion. Fresh wounds marked his flanks, and his left rear leg was clearly broken, bent at an unnatural angle that made Josie wince. For a moment she simply stood there, taking in the impossible sight. Elk rarely came this close to human habitation, and never in such a vulnerable state. This bull was enormous, easily 7 feet tall at the shoulder, with a rack of antlers that would have been the pride of any hunter's trophy room. Yet here he was, broken and dying behind her lodge, as if he had sought her out specifically. Josie had seen enough death during her 3 years on the frontier to recognize when an animal was beyond saving. The practical thing would be to put the elk out of its misery and butcher the meat before it spoiled. Winter was coming, and fresh venison would see her through the lean months ahead. But something in those dark, intelligent eyes stopped her from reaching for the rifle she always carried when checking her property. Instead, she found herself kneeling beside the massive creature, speaking in the same gentle tones she used to calm spooked horses. The elk's breathing was rapid and shallow, his body temperature elevated despite the cool morning air. He needed water, that much was clear, but how did one give water to a 700-pound wild animal without getting trampled in the process? "Easy there, big fellow," she whispered, slowly extending her hand toward his massive head. "I'm not going to hurt you. You're hurt bad enough already, aren't you?" The elk's eyes tracked her movement, but he didn't try to struggle away. If anything, he seemed to relax slightly at the sound of her voice. Josie had learned a few things about treating injured animals during her childhood on her father's farm back in Pennsylvania. She knew that shock and dehydration killed more wounded creatures than their actual injuries, especially large animals that had been running from predators or, in this case, possibly hunters. The elk's gums were pale and dry, his tongue lolling slightly from his mouth. She made her decision, quickly before common sense could change her mind. Racing back to the lodge, she grabbed her largest water bucket and filled it from the well. The trek back to the wounded elk tested her strength, the full bucket sloshing and threatening to spill with every step, but she managed to reach the animal without losing too much of the precious water. The next challenge was getting the elk to drink. She had no idea if he would accept help from a human or if his injuries had progressed too far for him to swallow properly. Carefully, she positioned the bucket near his head and began to pour small amounts of water directly into his mouth, pausing between each pour to let him swallow. To her amazement, the elk began to drink eagerly, his pink tongue working to lap up every drop she offered. His dark eyes never left her face, as if he were trying to memorize her features. There was something almost human in his gaze, an intelligence that seemed to acknowledge her kindness and express gratitude beyond what any wild animal should possess. For the next hour, Josie knelt beside the injured elk, offering him water and speaking to him in low, comforting tones. She examined his wounds more carefully, noting that many of them appeared to be from rope burns rather than natural injuries. Someone had tried to capture this magnificent creature, and he had fought free at great cost to himself. The broken leg was the most serious injury, but there were also deep cuts across his flanks, where ropes had bit into his hide. And what looked like bullet grazes along his neck. This elk hadn't just been injured in an accident. He had been hunted, trapped, and had somehow escaped his captors. As the morning wore on, more details of the elk's ordeal became clear. The remains of several snares were still tangled in his antlers, and his hooves showed evidence of running across rough terrain for miles. Someone had been very determined to capture this particular animal, and equally determined to do so alive rather than simply killing him for meat. The thought troubled Josie deeply. In her 3 years on the frontier, she had learned to distinguish between hunters who killed for survival and those who hunted for sport or profit. The evidence suggested that this elk had been the target of the latter type, men who saw animals as commodities rather than living creatures deserving of respect. By midday, the elk's condition had stabilized somewhat. The water had helped combat his dehydration, and his breathing had become more regular. His eyes were clearer now, more alert, and he had even attempted to shift his position several times. But the broken leg made it impossible for him to stand, and Josie knew that without proper medical attention, infection would likely set in within days. She faced an impossible choice. She had no experience treating injuries this severe, and even if she could somehow splint the elk's broken leg, there was no guarantee he would survive long enough to heal. The humane thing might still be to end his suffering quickly, but every time she looked into those intelligent dark eyes, she found herself unable to reach for her rifle. Instead, she continued to offer water and began bringing him tender grass from her own garden, anything that might help him regain his strength. The elk accepted her offerings gratefully and gradually began to show signs of trust that went beyond mere desperation. When she approached, he no longer tensed with fear, but seemed to actually welcome her presence. As afternoon faded into evening, Josie realized she had spent nearly the entire day beside the wounded elk. Her chickens had gone unfed, her vegetables unharvested, her normal routine completely abandoned, yet she felt no regret about the lost time. Something about this magnificent creature had captured her attention in a way that defied rational explanation. She was preparing to return to the lodge for the night when she noticed movement at the edge of the aspen grove. At first, she thought, it might be wolves drawn by the scent of the elk's blood. Her hand moved instinctively to the rifle at her side, but what emerged from the shadows was not a predator. A figure stood among the trees, tall and still, watching her tend to the wounded elk. Even in the fading light, she could make out the distinctive silhouette of a Native American warrior, his long hair hanging loose around his shoulders, his clothing the practical buckskin and leather of someone who lived entirely off the land. For a moment, neither of them moved. Josie had encountered Native Americans before, during her time on the frontier, mostly in trading posts and settlements. The interactions had always been cordial but brief, marked by mutual wariness rather than hostility. But this was different. This man was watching her with an intensity that made her acutely aware of how vulnerable she was, alone in the wilderness with no neighbors for miles. Yet she felt no fear. There was something in the stranger's posture, in the way he observed her care for the elk, that suggested respect rather than threat. He stood there for several long minutes, completely motionless, before finally melting back into the forest as silently as he had appeared. That night, Josie barely slept. She found herself rising every few hours to check on the elk, bringing him fresh water and checking his wounds by lantern light. Each time she approached, she half expected to find that he had died during her absence. But the great animal proved surprisingly resilient. By the third day of her vigil, the elk was showing remarkable signs of improvement. His wounds had stopped bleeding, his eyes were bright and alert, and he had even managed to prop himself up on his front legs for short periods. The broken rear leg was still a serious concern, but Josie had fashioned a crude splint using boards from her fence and strips of cloth from old dresses. More importantly, the elk had begun to show signs of genuine affection toward his unlikely caretaker. When Josie approached, he would nicker softly in greeting, a sound she had never heard from a wild elk before. He would rest his massive head against her shoulder while she tended his wounds, a gesture of trust that moved her to tears. Throughout those 3 days, Josie was aware of being watched. Not constantly, but at certain times of day, usually early morning or late evening, she would catch glimpses of the same tall figure observing from the tree line. He never approached, never made any attempt to communicate, but his presence was unmistakable. On the 4th morning, she decided to acknowledge her mysterious observer directly. As she carried fresh water to the elk, she spoke loudly enough for her voice to carry to the edge of the forest. "I know you're there," she called out, not looking toward the trees. "If you want to help, you're welcome to come closer. If you're planning harm, you should know I'm a fair shot with this rifle." Her voice was steady, neither challenging nor fearful. For several minutes there was no response. Then, moving with the fluid grace of someone completely at home in the wilderness, the figure stepped into the open. In full daylight, Josie could see that her observer was a young Native American man, probably in his late 20s, with the lean, muscular build of someone who lived by hunting and tracking. His face was striking rather than handsome in the conventional sense, with high cheekbones, dark eyes that seemed to miss nothing, and black hair that hung past his shoulders. He wore buckskin leggings and a shirt decorated with intricate beadwork, and a necklace of what appeared to be bear. Claws hung around his neck. A bow and quiver of arrows were slung across his back, and a knife in a beaded sheath hung at his side. Most remarkably, he approached the wounded elk without any sign of fear or hesitation. The great animal, who had shown wariness toward everything, except Josie herself, actually seemed to recognize the newcomer. His ears pricked forward, and he made that soft, nickering sound that Josie had come to associate with contentment. The stranger knelt beside the elk and began examining his wounds with the practiced eye of someone well-versed in animal medicine. His hands moved gently but confidently as he checked the splint Josie had applied to the broken leg, tested the elk's reflexes, and studied the rope burns on his flanks. After several minutes of silent examination, he looked up at Josie and spoke for the first time. His English was clear and precise, though accented with the rhythms of his native language. "You have done well," he said simply. "He will live because of your care." There was approval in his voice and something that might have been surprise. "Most of your people would have killed him for meat or left him to die. Why did you choose differently?" The question caught Josie off guard. She had been so focused on caring for the elk that she hadn't really examined her own motivations. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "I just couldn't walk away from something that was suffering when I had the power to help." The stranger studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. "What is your name?" he asked. "Josephine Tanner," she replied. But most folks, "Call me Josie, this is my homestead." She gestured toward the lodge and surrounding buildings. "And you are a Haute Eaglewing," he said, pronouncing each syllable clearly, "of the Cheyenne people. This elk is sacred to my tribe. His capture was ordered by men who do not understand what they sought to possess." The implications of his words sent a chill through Josie. "Sacred how?" she asked. Ahote's expression grew serious. "Among my people, there are certain animals that serve as messengers between the world of spirits and the world of the living. This elk is one such creature. The men who tried to capture him believed they could sell him to collectors in the East who pay great sums for exotic animals. They did not understand that some things cannot be owned." He paused, his gaze shifting between Josie and the elk. "When he escaped from their traps, he came here, to you. This was not by chance." As Ahote spoke, Josie began to understand that her encounter with the wounded elk was far more significant than she had realized. According to Cheyenne belief, the elk was a spiritual guardian, one of several sacred animals that maintained the balance between the natural and supernatural worlds. The spirits guided him to someone who would show him the kindness his captors denied, Ahote explained. "But this creates a bond between you and the elk that goes beyond simple gratitude. You have become part of his story, and he has become part of yours." The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. Josie had come to the frontier seeking independence and solitude, not spiritual responsibility toward mystical creatures. Yet she couldn't deny the deep connection she felt to the magnificent animal she had spent days nursing back to health. "What does that mean exactly?" she asked. Ahote was quiet for several minutes, watching the elk with an expression that seemed to blend reverence and concern. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of ancient tradition. "It means that your fate and his are now intertwined. The spirits have tested your heart and found it worthy. But such honor comes with obligations. There will be choices ahead that will test not just your courage, but your understanding of what it means to live in harmony with forces greater than yourself." Before Josie could ask what kinds of choices he meant, Ahote rose smoothly to his feet. "The elk grows stronger each day because of your care, but his healing will take time. I will help you tend to him, if you will accept my assistance." The offer surprised her. In 3 years on the frontier, she had grown accustomed to handling every challenge alone. The idea of accepting help, especially from someone whose culture and way of life were so different from her own, felt both appealing and unsettling. "Why would you want to help?" she asked. "Because the elk has chosen you as his guardian, and the elk is sacred to my people. What serves his well-being serves the spiritual balance of this land. Also," and here Ahote's stern expression softened slightly, "because you have shown him kindness when you could have chosen cruelty. Such actions deserve to be honored." As if in response to their conversation, the elk lifted his great head and looked directly at both humans. His dark eyes held that same intelligent awareness that had struck Josie from the beginning, but now there seemed to be something more, a sense of expectation, as if he too understood that this meeting between his two caretakers was significant. "All right," Josie said finally, "I accept your help, but I have one condition. I want to understand what's really happening here. If this elk is as special as you say, and if my helping him has some kind of spiritual significance, I need to know what I'm getting myself into." Ahote nodded approvingly. "Wisdom speaks through your request. Yes, you deserve to know the full truth, but understanding will take time, and some knowledge can only be shared when you are ready to receive it properly. For now, focus on helping the elk complete his healing. The rest will reveal itself when the time is right." As the sun began to set behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Josie felt as though she stood at the threshold of a new chapter in her life. The wounded elk that had appeared behind her lodge had brought with him not just the need for compassion, but the promise of adventures and challenges she could never have imagined. The frontier had always been a place where the unexpected could happen, where lives could be transformed by a single decision or chance encounter. But as she looked at the magnificent elk resting peacefully beside her lodge, and at the mysterious Cheyenne warrior who had emerged from the forest to help her care for him, Josie realized that her transformation was only beginning. What she didn't know, as she settled in for another night of tending to her unlikely patient, was that her act of mercy had already set in motion events that would test everything she believed about courage, loyalty, and the mysterious connections that bind all living things together on the vast frontier. 2 weeks had passed since Ohote Eaglewing first emerged from the aspen grove, and the elk's recovery had progressed beyond Josie's wildest hopes. The magnificent creature could now stand for extended periods, though he still favored his injured leg. His wounds had healed cleanly, leaving only faint scars beneath his thick coat, and his eyes had regained their full alertness and intelligence. Ohote had proven to be an invaluable partner in the elk's care. He arrived each morning just after sunrise, moving through the forest with such silence that Josie often didn't realize he was there until she saw him kneeling beside their patient. His knowledge of animal medicine far exceeded anything she had learned on her father's farm, and, under his guidance, they had created poultices and treatments that accelerated the healing process remarkably. More surprisingly, Josie found herself looking forward to Ohote's daily visits for reasons that had nothing to do with the elk's medical needs. The Cheyenne warrior possessed a quiet wisdom and dry sense of humor that made even the most mundane tasks feel meaningful. He told stories while they worked, tales of his people's history and relationship with the land that opened Josie's eyes to aspects of frontier life she had never considered. On this particular October morning, Josie stepped out of her lodge, expecting to find Ohote already tending to the elk, as had become their routine. Instead, she discovered something that made her stop dead in her tracks. Hanging from her fence post, tied with strips of rawhide, were 3 magnificent eagle feathers. Each feather was pristine, the kind that took a skilled hunter weeks to acquire, and they caught the early morning light like burnished gold. Beside the feathers, wrapped in soft doe skin, was a piece of carved bone about the size of her palm. The carving depicted an elk in intricate detail, so lifelike that it seemed ready to leap from the bone surface. At the base of the carving were symbols she didn't recognize, flowing lines and geometric patterns that seemed to tell a story in a language she couldn't read. Josie looked around for any sign of Ohote, but the forest remained silent. The elk stood near the lodge, fully alert and watching her with what seemed like anticipation. There were no tracks in the soft earth around the fence, no indication of how the gifts had arrived or who had left them. She had learned enough from Ohote over the past 2 weeks to understand that eagle feathers were not casual gifts among Native American tribes. They represented honor, courage, and spiritual connection, earned through acts of exceptional bravery or wisdom. The fact that someone had left 3 of them at her fence suggested significance far beyond simple gratitude for caring for an injured animal. When Ohote arrived an hour later, Josie was waiting with the feathers and carving laid out on a blanket, beside the elk. His reaction to seeing the gifts was immediate and profound. His usually composed expression shifted to one of amazement, followed quickly by something that looked almost like reverence. "These are from my grandfather," he said, quietly, kneeling to examine the carved bone. "White Thunder, the eldest medicine man of our tribe. He carved this elk himself, and these feathers come from the sacred eagle that nests above our winter village." Ohote's voice carried a weight that made Josie understand she was looking at objects of immense cultural and spiritual value. Why? Would he give them to me? She asked. Though part of her already suspected the answer, Ahote was silent for several minutes, turning the bone carving over in his hands with careful reverence. When he finally spoke, his words carried the formal cadence of someone delivering an important message. My grandfather has been watching from the sacred places, observing how you have cared for the elk. In our tradition, when someone shows such selfless devotion to one of the sacred messengers, they become eligible to receive the blessing of the eagle spirit. These feathers mark you as someone the spirits have chosen to honor. But there is more, he continued, his dark eyes meeting hers directly. White Thunder has had visions about you, dreams that speak of changes coming to this land. The railroad men survey ever closer to our territory, bringing with them settlers and soldiers who do not understand the sacred places. The balance that has existed here for generations is threatened. In his dreams, White Thunder sees a time when the sacred animals will need protection not just from individual hunters, but from forces that would destroy the wilderness itself. He believes you have been chosen to play a role in that protection, but first you must prove yourself worthy of the eagle's blessing through a test of courage and wisdom. The weight of Ahote's words settled over Josie like a heavy blanket. She had come to the frontier seeking solitude and independence, not spiritual responsibility for an entire ecosystem. Yet she couldn't deny the deep connection she felt to the elk, or the sense that her encounter with him had been far from coincidental. What? A kind of test, she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Ahote's explanation of the test both thrilled and terrified her. According to Cheyenne tradition, those chosen to receive the eagle's blessing must demonstrate their worthiness through participation in a sacred hunt. But this was no ordinary hunting expedition. The quarry was not an animal to be killed, but a spiritual challenge to be overcome. Deep in the mountains, 2 days' ride from here, there is a place my people call Eagle's Throne, Ahote explained. It is a canyon where the sacred eagles nest, surrounded by cliffs so high they seem to touch the sky itself. At the heart of this place stands a pillar of stone, and at its summit grows a single pine tree that has weathered storms for more generations than any man can count. The test requires you to climb this pillar alone and without assistance, and retrieve a single pine cone from the ancient tree. But the climb is not the true challenge. The pillar is guarded by the spirit of the first eagle, a creature of immense power that tests the courage and purity of purpose of all who approach. Many warriors have attempted this climb over the years. Some turn back when they see the spirit eagle's terrible beauty. Others reach the pillar, but find themselves unable to begin the ascent, overwhelmed by the spiritual power of the place. A few have begun the climb, only to fall when their courage failed them at crucial moments. But those who succeed, who reach the summit and return with the sacred pine cone, receive not just the blessing of the eagle spirit, but the knowledge and power needed to serve as guardians of the sacred places. They become bridges between the world of spirits and the world of the living, protectors of the balance that keeps both worlds in harmony. Josie listened to this explanation with growing amazement and trepidation. The idea of climbing an impossible stone pillar while being tested by a spirit eagle sounded like something from a fever dream rather than reality. Yet the sincerity in Ahote's voice and the reverence with which he described the sacred place made it impossible to dismiss his words as mere superstition. "And if I fail," she asked, "then you return here and continue your life as before." Ahote replied, "The elk will complete his healing and return to the wild, and you will remain blessed for the kindness you have shown him. But the greater calling, the chance to become a true guardian of the sacred places, will pass to another." However, he added, his expression growing more serious, "there is danger in the attempt itself. The climb is treacherous, and the spiritual forces at work in Eagle's throne can overwhelm those unprepared for their intensity. My grandfather's visions suggest you have the strength needed for this test, but visions can be misinterpreted, and the spirits sometimes choose to test us in ways we do not expect. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. For 3 days, Josie wrestled with the decision. The practical part of her mind pointed out the obvious problems with Ahote's proposal. She was a frontier woman, not a mystical warrior. Her experience with climbing consisted of scrambling up rocky hillsides to collect berries, not scaling impossible stone pillars while being tested by spirit eagles. Moreover, winter was approaching rapidly, and she needed to focus on preparing her homestead for the harsh months ahead. Her vegetables needed harvesting, her firewood needed cutting, and her livestock required constant attention. Taking off on a spiritual quest seemed like the height of irresponsibility. But another part of her mind, a part that had been growing, stronger since the elk's arrival, whispered different arguments. She had already experienced things on the frontier that defied rational explanation. The elk's seemingly intelligent responses to her care, Ahote's uncanny ability to appear and disappear like smoke, the deep sense of connection she felt to the land around her homestead. All of these suggested that the world contained mysteries beyond her previous understanding. More compelling was the growing certainty that her quiet life on the frontier was about to change, whether she wanted it to or not. Ahote had mentioned railroad surveys and increasing settlement pressure. Even in her isolation, she had noticed signs of encroaching civilization, survey markers appearing on distant ridgelines, the sound of machinery echoing from valleys that had once known only wind and wildlife. If the choice was between hiding from these changes or actively working to protect the wild places that had become her refuge, the answer seemed obvious. The question was whether she possessed the courage to follow through on her convictions. The elk seemed to sense her internal struggle. During those 3 days of deliberation, he remained close to the lodge, often resting his great head against her shoulder as if offering comfort and encouragement. His presence reminded her that she had already taken one leap of faith by choosing to help him rather than simply harvesting his meat. Perhaps it was time for another leap. On the morning of the 4th day, she found Ahote waiting beside the elk as usual. But this time, he had brought additional supplies, a bow and quiver of arrows, a pack filled with traveling provisions, and a sturdy mountain pony that stood patiently among the aspens. "You knew I would decide to go," she said, though it was more observation than question. "I hoped you would," he replied simply, "but the choice had to be yours alone. No one can be compelled to seek the eagle's blessing. It must be chosen freely, with full understanding of what the commitment entails." "Are you ready to begin the journey?" he asked. They set out immediately after Josie had made final preparations for her extended absence. The elk watched them leave with an expression that seemed almost human in its complexity, sadness at their departure mixed with approval for her decision. As they rode away from the homestead, Josie felt a pang of uncertainty about leaving her sanctuary behind. But the feeling faded as they climbed higher into the mountains, following ancient game trails that wound through landscapes of stunning beauty. Ahote proved to be an excellent traveling companion, knowledgeable about every aspect of wilderness survival and generous with his expertise. He showed her how to read weather signs in cloud formations, how to find fresh water by observing animal behavior, and how to move through dense forest without leaving obvious tracks. More importantly, he continued her education in the spiritual, beliefs that governed his people's relationship with the natural world. Every landmark they passed had a story. Every unusual rock formation or ancient tree carried significance that connected it to the larger web of sacred places that crisscrossed the frontier. Your people see the wilderness as something to be conquered, he explained as they made camp on their first night. Ours see it as something to be joined with. The difference shapes everything: how we hunt, how we build our homes, how we raise our children. What you're about to attempt at Eagle's Throne requires you to think like one of my people, at least for the duration of the test. How do I do that? Josie asked. By understanding that you are not separate from the land, but part of it. The rock you will climb is not an obstacle to be overcome, but a living thing with its own spirit and its own will. The eagle that will test you is not an enemy to be defeated, but a teacher whose lessons come in forms you might not expect. Success comes not from imposing your will on these forces, but from finding harmony with them. The concept challenged everything Josie had learned about frontier survival, which emphasized self-reliance, determination, and the conquest of natural obstacles through sheer force of will. But as she thought about her relationship with the wounded elk, she began to understand what Ahote meant. Her success in healing the great animal had come not from dominating him, but from earning his trust and working with his natural healing processes. On the afternoon of their second day, they crested a ridge and looked down into a valley unlike anything Josie had ever seen. The landscape below seemed carved from different stone than the surrounding mountains, with towering spires and impossibly deep canyons creating a maze of shadows and light. At the valley's heart, a single pillar of red stone rose nearly 1,000 feet into the air, perfectly straight and narrow, topped with a single pine tree that seemed impossibly small from their vantage point. Eagle's Throne, Ahote said simply, though his voice carried the reverence reserved for the most sacred places. Even from miles away, Josie could feel the power emanating from the stone pillar. The air itself seemed different here, charged with an energy that made her skin tingle and her pulse quicken. Birds of prey circled the spire in lazy spirals, their cries echoing off the canyon walls with an almost musical quality. The eagles. That nest here are different from others of their kind, Ahote explained as they began their descent into the valley. Larger, more intelligent, and infused with spiritual power that connects them directly to the realm of the ancestors. The spirit eagle that will test you is the greatest of them all, a creature that has existed since the first days of the world and will continue long after the last human has returned to dust. As they made camp at the base of the pillar that evening, Josie studied the stone formation that represented her challenge. The climb looked impossible. The rock face was nearly vertical, with few handholds visible from ground level. Even experienced mountaineers would have considered the ascent extremely dangerous, and she had no mountaineering experience whatsoever. How am I supposed to climb that? She asked, voicing her doubts for the first time. Ahote smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious features. The same way you helped heal the elk. Not by forcing your will upon it, but by listening to what it tells you and working with its nature rather than against it. The rock will show you the path, but only if you approach it with the right spirit. Tomorrow at dawn, you will begin the ascent alone. I will wait here and watch, but I cannot offer assistance or advice once you begin. This test belongs to you alone, and its outcome will depend entirely on your courage, wisdom, and ability to hear the voices that speak from the stone itself. That night, as she lay in her bedroll staring up at the impossible pillar silhouetted against the star-filled sky, Josie wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. The rational part of her mind insisted that what Ahote described was impossible, that stones did not speak and spirit eagles existed only in ancient superstitions. But the wounded elk had seemed impossible too, until she knelt beside him and felt the undeniable intelligence in his dark eyes. The frontier was full of mysteries that defied explanation, and perhaps her mistake was not in attempting this challenge, but in assuming that reality was limited to what she could see and touch and measure. As sleep finally claimed her, Josie's dreams were filled with soaring eagles and ancient stone, with voices that called to her from heights she had never imagined reaching, promising knowledge and power beyond anything her former life could have offered. The first light of dawn painted the red stone pillar in shades of fire and gold, transforming the impossible spire into something that seemed more divine than earthly. Josie stood at its base, her neck craned back to study the 1,000-foot ascent that awaited her. In the growing light, she could make out details invisible the night before: narrow ledges, hairline cracks in the stone, and what might have been ancient handholds carved by some long-forgotten people. Ahote had awakened her before sunrise, with the breakfast of jerky and pine needle tea, but had spoken little during the meal. Now he stood several yards away, his expression grave but encouraging. The moment had come for her to begin the test that would either transform her into a guardian of the sacred places or prove her unworthy of such responsibility. "Remember," he said quietly, "the stone will speak to you, but only if you listen. With more than your ears. Your hands will find holds that your eyes cannot see, but only if you trust in the connection between your spirit and the spirit of the mountain itself. Most importantly, when the great eagle comes, and it will come, do not let fear drive you to hasty action. The test is not about conquering the eagle, but about understanding what it represents." Josie nodded, though her mouth felt dry with anticipation and fear. She had equipped herself with the basic climbing gear Ahote had provided: soft-soled, moccasins for better grip, a coiled rope for emergency use, and a small pouch of powdered resin to improve her hand grip on smooth stone. But she knew that success or failure would depend more on courage and spiritual insight than on equipment. She pressed her palms against the warm red stone, closing her eyes and trying to feel the connection Ahote had described. For a moment, nothing happened. Then gradually, she became aware of something she had never noticed before: a faint vibration in the rock, like the heartbeat of some vast, sleeping creature. The stone was alive in ways that defied scientific explanation, and as she opened herself to that reality, she began to sense possible routes up the seemingly impossible face. "I can feel it," she whispered, wonder coloring her voice. "The stone is warm, and it's almost like it's showing me where to climb." "Then you are ready," Ahote replied. "Go with the blessing of the spirits, and return with the wisdom only the eagle can provide." The first 100 feet of the climb proved surprisingly manageable. The handholds Josie had sensed while touching the stone's base revealed themselves clearly as she ascended, and her fingers found purchase on ledges and in cracks that seemed almost designed for human hands. Her body moved with a fluid grace she had never experienced before, as if the stone itself were guiding her movements. But as she climbed higher, the nature of the test began to change. The handholds became smaller and more widely spaced, requiring her to stretch her body to its limits to reach each new grip. More challenging still, the stone face began to overhang slightly, forcing her to climb partially inverted while fighting the constant pull of gravity. By the time she had reached the 300-foot mark, Josie's arms and legs were trembling with exhaustion. Sweat stung her eyes despite the cool mountain air, and her breathing had become labored from the combination of physical exertion and high altitude. She paused on a narrow ledge to rest, trying not to look down at the dizzying drop below her. It was then that she first heard the eagle's cry. The sound echoed off the canyon walls with supernatural power, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was deeper and more resonant than any eagle call she had ever heard, carrying undertones that stirred something primal in her soul. Fear and awe warred within her as she scanned the sky for the source of the sound. When the great eagle finally appeared, it took Josie's breath away completely. The creature was enormous, with a wingspan that seemed to block out the sun itself. Its feathers shimmered with an inner light that shifted through all the colors of flame, and its eyes held an intelligence so profound that looking into them felt like staring into the depths of eternity itself. The spirit eagle circled the pillar slowly, studying her with obvious interest. Its flight generated winds that pressed against her body with surprising force, threatening to tear her from her precarious perch. But there was no malice in the creature's behavior, only evaluation. It was taking her measure, determining whether she possessed the qualities necessary to complete the sacred test. As the eagle completed its third circle around the pillar, it suddenly dove directly toward Josie with terrifying speed. Every instinct screamed at her to flatten herself against the stone face or try to shield herself with her arms. But Ahote's words echoed in her memory. The test was not about conquering the eagle, but about understanding what it represented. Instead of cowering, Josie forced herself to remain upright on her narrow ledge and look directly into the spirit. Eagle's blazing eyes. As the massive bird swept past her, close enough that its wingtip feathers brushed her shoulder, she felt a shock of recognition that went deeper than conscious thought. The eagle was not testing her courage in the face of physical danger. It was testing her willingness to see beyond surface appearances to underlying truth. The creature's fierce beauty and predatory power were real, but they masked something else entirely, a profound sadness that spoke of countless years watching the sacred places diminish as human civilization expanded across the land. "You grieve for what is being lost," Josie called out to the circling eagle, her voice carrying clearly in the thin air. "The wild places, the old ways, the balance between all living things, that's what this is really about, isn't it?" The eagle's response was immediate and unmistakable. It pulled out of its aggressive dive and began to circle the pillar in a different pattern, slower, more ceremonial, its cry now carrying notes of approval rather than challenge. The first test had been passed, but Josie sensed there would be others before she reached the summit. She resumed climbing with renewed confidence, her movements now flowing in rhythm with the eagle's circling flight. The stone seemed to respond to her deeper understanding, revealing new handholds and footholds that had been invisible before. But the physical challenges continued to intensify as she climbed higher. At the 600-foot mark, something extraordinary happened. As Josie reached for a handhold near a distinctive outcropping of darker stone, her vision suddenly shifted. The world around her dissolved into swirling colors and impossible geometries, and she found herself experiencing what could only be described as a waking dream. She was no longer clinging to a stone pillar in the Wyoming territory. Instead, she stood in a vast lodge made of buffalo hide and decorated with intricate paintings that told the history of the Cheyenne people. Around her sat the tribal elders, their faces painted for ceremony, their eyes reflecting the wisdom of countless generations. In the center of the circle sat an ancient man whose presence radiated spiritual power like heat from a forge. Though she had never seen him before, Josie knew instinctively that this was White Thunder, Ahote's grandfather and the medicine man who had sent her the eagle feathers. "Welcome, guardian who walks between worlds," White Thunder said, his voice carrying clearly despite the dreamlike nature of the vision. "You have climbed far, but the greatest challenges still await. Are you prepared to see the true scope of the responsibility you seek to accept?" Before Josie could answer, the lodge around her transformed into a bird's-eye view of the entire frontier region. She could see her own homestead far below, with the healing elk standing peacefully beside her lodge. But she could also see things that filled her with dread. Railroad lines stretching like scars across pristine valleys, mining operations that turned crystalline streams into muddy wasteland, and vast herds of cattle that stripped the grasslands bare. "This is what comes if the sacred places lose their guardians," White Thunder explained. not just the destruction of beautiful landscapes, but the severing of the spiritual connections that keep the world in balance. The animals lose their way, the seasons become erratic, and the very soul of the land begins to die. But there is another possibility, he continued, and the vision shifted to show the same region transformed by a different kind of human presence. Here, settlements existed in harmony with the natural world, their inhabitants understanding themselves as caretakers rather than conquerors. The wildlife thrived, the waters ran clear, and an almost visible network of spiritual energy connected all living things in a web of mutual support. This is what can be achieved if enough guardians accept their calling. But the work is dangerous, and the sacrifices are real. Those who serve as bridges between the spirit world and the physical world often find themselves belonging fully to neither. Are you prepared for such a life? The weight of White Thunder's question pressed down on Josie like a physical force. In her former life in Pennsylvania, she had dreamed of adventure and independence, but her fantasies had never included spiritual responsibility for an entire ecosystem. The magnitude of what was being asked of her was overwhelming. Yet, as she considered the two visions White Thunder had shown her, the choice seemed obvious. She had already witnessed the beginning of the destructive transformation, the survey stakes, the distant sound of machinery, the gradual disappearance of wildlife from areas that had once teemed with life. If she had the power to help prevent that destruction, how could she refuse? "I accept," she said firmly, her voice ringing with conviction despite the dreamlike setting. "But I'll need guidance. I don't understand the spirit world well enough to serve as a bridge between worlds on my own." White Thunder smiled, the expression transforming his ancient features. "Understanding will come with experience, and you will not be alone in this work. There are others like you, scattered across the frontier, each serving as guardian for their own sacred place. In time you will meet them and learn from their experience. But first, you must complete the test. The eagle waits to give you its final lesson, and only after that lesson is learned can you receive the true blessing of the sacred pine." The vision dissolved as suddenly as it had begun, leaving Josie clinging to the stone face of the pillar with her heart racing and her mind reeling. But the experience had changed something fundamental inside her. The climb no longer felt like a physical challenge to be conquered through strength and determination. Instead, it had become a spiritual journey toward understanding and acceptance of her true purpose. The spirit eagle had remained circling throughout her vision, but now its behavior changed dramatically. Instead of the ceremonial flight pattern it had maintained, the great bird settled onto a ledge just above Josie's position. Up close, its size was even more impressive. Its body was easily 4 feet long, and its wingspan would have measured 12 feet or more if fully extended. But what struck Josie most powerfully were the eagle's eyes. They held depths that seemed to contain the accumulated wisdom of ages, and when she looked into them, she felt as though she were communing with the very spirit of the wilderness itself. The eagle spoke to her not in words, but in images and emotions that flooded her consciousness with startling clarity. She saw the pillar as it had been in ancient times, when the first Cheyenne peoples had discovered it and recognized its spiritual significance. She witnessed the generations of vision quests that had taken place here, each seeker climbing toward their own moment of revelation and transformation. She felt the sorrow of the eagle as human civilization gradually encroached upon the sacred places, driving away the wildlife and severing the spiritual connections that had sustained the land for millennia. But she also experienced the eagle's hope, its belief that guardians like her could help restore the balance before it was lost forever. The eagle showed her glimpses of her possible future, working alongside other guardians to protect sacred sites, teaching settlers to live in harmony with the land rather than exploiting it, and serving as a bridge between the advancing tide. of civilization and the ancient wisdom of the indigenous peoples. The communication lasted only minutes, but it felt like hours of the most intense education Josie had ever received. When it ended, the eagle let out a single piercing cry and launched itself from the ledge. But instead of flying away, it circled the pillar one final time and dropped a single feather at Josie's feet. This feather was different from the one she had found at her fence. It glowed with the same inner light she had seen in the eagle's plumage, and when she picked it up, it felt warm to the touch and seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. She understood instinctively that this was more than a token of the eagle's approval. It was a tool that would help her in her future work as a guardian. The final 200 feet of the climb passed in a state that could only be described as transcendent. Josie's body moved without conscious direction, her hands and feet finding holds with supernatural certainty. The exhaustion and fear that had plagued her earlier in the ascent were replaced by a sense of purposeful flow, as if she had become one with the stone itself. When she finally pulled herself onto the summit of the pillar, she found herself in a place that seemed to exist outside normal space and time. The ancient pine tree that crowned the spire was unlike any she had ever seen. Its trunk was twisted into impossible spirals, its bark shimmered with the same inner light as the eagle's feathers, and its branches seemed to move in response to winds that existed only in the spirit world. At the tree's base, scattered like offerings, lay dozens of pine cones from countless generations of successful vision quests. Some were fresh and brown, others had aged to silver grey, and a few had petrified into stone-like hardness that suggested incredible antiquity. Josie understood that she was looking at physical proof of the sacred site's importance stretching back through centuries of human spiritual seeking. She approached the tree with reverence, acutely aware that she was in the presence of something far older and wiser than herself. As she reached toward one of the fresh cones hanging from a low branch, the tree itself seemed to respond, lowering the branch to make her task easier. The cone that fell into her hand was warm and seemed to vibrate with stored spiritual energy. But the true revelation came when she turned to begin her descent and saw the view from the summit. The entire frontier region spread out below her like a vast map, but overlaid on the familiar landscape was a network of glowing lines that connected sacred site to sacred site across hundreds of miles. She could see other pillars like the one she stood on, ancient groves that pulsed with spiritual power, caves that served as gateways to the underground realm of spirits. For the first time, she truly understood the scope of what she was being asked to protect. It wasn't just individual locations, but an entire spiritual ecosystem that gave meaning and balance to the physical world. The network of sacred places was like the nervous system of the land itself, and the guardians were the cells that kept that system healthy and functioning. The climb down proved to be entirely different from the ascent, where going up had required intense focus and careful attention to each handhold. The descent flowed with dreamlike ease. The stone seemed to mold itself to her needs, creating steps and handholds that hadn't existed during her upward journey. More remarkably, she found herself occasionally moving through short sections of the rock face as if it were insubstantial, emerging from solid stone without any clear memory of how the transition had occurred. By the time her feet touched the ground at the pillar's base, Josie had become something more than the frontier woman who had begun the climb at dawn. The sacred pine cone in her hand pulsed with gentle warmth. The spirit eagle's feather seemed to glow against her skin, and her perception of the world around her had been permanently altered. Ahote was waiting where she had left him, but his expression as she approached told her that he could see the change in her as clearly as she could feel it. She moved with fluid grace that hadn't been there before, and her eyes held depths that spoke of communication with forces beyond the physical world. "You have been transformed," he said simply, though his voice carried profound satisfaction and pride. "You are no longer merely Josephine Tanner, homesteader. You have become Josephine Tanner, guardian of the sacred places. The spirits have accepted you as one of their own." Josie nodded, though she was still processing the full implications of what had happened to her on the pillar. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. "I understand now why the elk came to me," she said slowly. "It wasn't coincidence. I was being tested, prepared for this moment. Everything that has happened has been part of a larger pattern. And I understand what comes next," she continued, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "The railroad surveyors, the mining operations, the settlers who see the land only as something to be exploited, they're all threats to the sacred places. As a guardian, it's my responsibility to protect those places, even if it means standing against forces much larger and more powerful than myself." Ahote smiled, the expression reflecting both approval and anticipation. "Yes, but you will not stand alone. The network of guardians is stronger than any individual, and you will find allies in places you do not expect. The transformation you have undergone today is only the beginning of a journey that will test and strengthen you in ways you cannot yet imagine." As they prepared to break camp and begin the journey back to her homestead, Josie felt the weight of her new responsibilities settling around her like a cloak. The quiet life she had built on the frontier was ending, but in its place was arising something far more meaningful and significant than anything she could have achieved through solitude and self-reliance alone. The sacred pine cone in her pouch seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat, a constant reminder that she now carried within herself a piece of the eternal connection between the physical and spiritual worlds. The eagle's feather whispered against her skin with each step, promising guidance and protection in the challenges ahead. The journey back to Josie's homestead took on an entirely different character than their outbound trip, where the ride to Eagle's Throne had been filled with anticipation and spiritual preparation. The return was marked by urgency and growing dread. Ahote had received disturbing news from Cheyenne scouts who had intercepted them halfway through their second day of travel. A large expedition of railroad surveyors and military escorts had arrived in the valley while they were away, setting up a temporary camp less than 5 miles from Josie's homestead. More ominously, the expedition included several men who matched the descriptions of the elk poachers who had originally wounded the sacred animal. The forces that threatened the sacred places were no longer distant possibilities, but immediate and present dangers. Josie felt the sacred pine cone pulse with increased intensity in her pouch as they crested the final ridge before her valley. Her transformed senses, still adjusting to their new capabilities, detected wrongness in the spiritual atmosphere around her home. The natural harmony that had always characterized the area was disrupted, replaced by a discordant energy that made her skin crawl. "They have brought iron machines onto sacred ground," Ahote observed grimly as they surveyed the valley below. "The surveyor's equipment disturbs the spiritual balance, but there is something else, something that feels deliberately malevolent rather than merely ignorant." Through her enhanced perception, Josie could see what he meant. The surveyor's camp was positioned directly across one of the glowing spiritual lines she had observed from the summit of Eagle's Throne. The heavy machinery they had brought with them, steam-powered drilling equipment, iron rails for temporary track laying, and massive surveying instruments, created dark spots in the spiritual landscape like infected wounds. But more disturbing was the presence she sensed near her own homestead. The elk was there, she could feel his familiar spiritual signature, but he was agitated and frightened in a way she had never experienced from him before. Something or someone was threatening the sacred animal, and as his designated guardian, Josie felt compelled to act immediately. They found the source of the elk's distress when they crested the final hill overlooking Josie's property. 3 men with rifles were positioned around her lodge, clearly attempting to corner the elk who had taken refuge behind the building. The sacred animal was trapped between the hunters and the steep drop-off that marked the edge of Josie's property. His magnificent antlers lowered defensively as he faced his tormentors. One of the men Josie recognized immediately, Marcus Holloway, a professional animal collector who had been operating throughout the territory for the past year. Holloway specialized in capturing exotic wildlife alive for wealthy Eastern collectors who paid premium prices for unusual specimens. His presence confirmed Ahote's earlier explanation about the elk's original capture and escape. "That's the beast that got away from us 3 weeks ago," Holloway was saying to his companions as Josie and Ahote approached undetected through the aspen grove. "Worth at least $500 to the right buyer in Boston, maybe more if we can keep those antlers intact. Magnificent specimen like that will make us all rich men. The question is how we take him down without damaging the merchandise," replied one of his associates, a lean man with cruel eyes who kept his rifle trained on the elk's head. "Tranquilizing dart would be ideal, but we don't have the equipment with us." "Net and ropes worked before," suggested the third hunter. "Animals already been through the process once. Might be easier to subdue this time around." Josie felt rage building inside her unlike anything she had ever experienced. But this was not the unfocused anger of her former life. It was the focused, purposeful wrath of a guardian witnessing a direct assault on her sacred charge. The pine cone in her pouch grew hot against her skin, and the eagle feather seemed to whisper instructions directly into her mind. "They cannot be allowed to take him," she whispered to Ahote. "The elk is under my protection now, and these men have already proven they will use any means necessary to capture him. Words alone will not deter them." Ahote nodded grimly, unsurprising his bow and checking the fletching on his arrows. 3 against 2. But we have advantages they do not. You have the power of the sacred places flowing through you now, and I know this terrain better than any white man ever could. How do you wish to proceed?" Josie closed her eyes and reached out with her newly awakened spiritual senses, feeling for the network of sacred energy that connected her homestead to the larger web of power she had observed from Eagle's throne. What she found both amazed and terrified her. The spiritual lines were responding to her presence, growing brighter and more active as she focused her attention on them. "I can feel the land itself," she whispered in wonder. "It's angry about the intrusion, about the threat to the elk. The spiritual energy wants to act, but it needs direction, purpose. It needs someone to show it how to protect what is sacred." The eagle feather against her skin grew warm, and suddenly Josie understood what was expected of her. The transformation she had undergone at Eagle's throne was not just symbolic. It had given her the ability to channel and direct the spiritual forces that permeated the sacred places. She was no longer just a guardian in name, but a guardian, with real power to protect what was under her care. "Stay back," she told Ahote. "I need to handle this myself. What I'm about to do will either prove that my transformation was genuine, or demonstrate that I'm not yet ready for the responsibilities I've accepted." She stepped out of the aspen grove and walked directly toward the 3 hunters, making no attempt at concealment. Her movement was fluid and purposeful, and something in her bearing made all 3 men turn toward her with expressions of surprise and growing unease. "Gentlemen," she called out when she was still 50 yards away, her voice carrying clearly across the open ground. "You are trespassing on my property and threatening an animal under my protection. I strongly suggest you leave immediately." Holloway laughed, though the sound carried a note of uncertainty. "Mrs. Tanner, isn't it? We met briefly at the trading post in Laramie last month. I'm afraid you're interfering with legitimate business here. This elk is valuable livestock that escaped from my custody 3 weeks ago." "The elk belongs to no one," Josie replied, continuing her steady advance. "He is a sacred animal under the protection of forces you cannot understand or control. Your presence here violates not just territorial law, but spiritual law that carries consequences far more severe than any human court could impose." The lean hunter with cruel eyes shifted his rifle toward Josie. "Lady, you're talking nonsense, and you're outnumbered 3-1. Best thing for everyone involved is if you just turn around and go back to your kitchen where you belong." That was when Josie discovered the true extent of her transformation. The insult and threat triggered something deep within her that was no longer entirely human. The sacred pine cone in her pouch erupted with heat. The eagle feather seemed to catch fire against her skin, and the spiritual energy of the land rose up in response to her call. What happened next defied every law of nature the three hunters thought they understood. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble, not with the regular rhythm of an earthquake, but with a pulsing vibration that seemed to emanate from the spiritual lines running beneath the homestead. The air itself grew thick and electric, charged with power that made their hair stand on end and their skin tingle. "What the hell is happening?" the third hunter shouted, his voice cracking with fear as he struggled to maintain his footing. On the shaking ground, Josie raised her hands, and the trembling intensified, but more dramatically, the wildlife of the surrounding forest began to respond to her call. Eagles appeared in the sky overhead, not just one or two, but dozens of them, circling in tight formation with their cries echoing off the mountain walls. Wolves emerged from the tree line, their eyes glowing with reflected spiritual energy as they formed a semicircle behind the three intruders. Most impressive of all, the elk himself seemed to grow larger and more magnificent before their eyes. His antlers gleamed with the same inner light Josie had seen in the spirit eagle's feathers, and his dark eyes now blazed with unmistakable intelligence and power. He was no longer just a wounded animal seeking shelter, but a spiritual guardian, revealing his true nature. "You have made a grave mistake," Josie said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to come from the earth itself. "This land is under sacred protection, and I am its appointed guardian. The forces you see gathering around you are just the beginning of what will happen if you persist in your threats." Holloway tried to raise his rifle, but found that his hands were shaking too badly to aim properly. The weapon felt impossibly heavy in his grip, as if the metal itself were fighting against his intentions. His companions were having similar difficulties, their faces pale with terror as they struggled to comprehend what was happening around them. "This is impossible," Holloway stammered. "There's no such thing as magic or sacred animals or any of this supernatural nonsense. We're civilized men conducting legitimate business. Your civilization is built on the destruction of what you cannot understand or control," Josie replied, taking another step forward. "But there are older powers in this world, forces that existed long before your railroads and your mining operations and your caged menageries. Those forces have chosen me as their instrument, and I will not allow you to harm what is under my protection." As if summoned by her words, more manifestations of the land's power began to appear around the homestead. The very trees seemed to lean inward, their branches reaching toward the three hunters like grasping fingers. The stream that ran past Josie's property began to glow with soft phosphorescence, and shapes that might have been fish, or might have been something far more mysterious, moved through its luminous waters. But most unsettling were the figures that began materializing at the edge of the clearing. Translucent forms that appeared to be Native American warriors from generations past, standing silently with their hands resting on spectral weapons. These were the spirits of those who had protected the sacred places in life and continued their vigil in death. "You see them now?" Ahote's voice came from behind the hunters, though he remained invisible among the aspens. "The guardians who came before, those who gave their lives to protect what you would destroy for profit. They have been waiting for someone worthy to take up their cause, and they have found her in Josephine Tanner." The lean hunter with cruel eyes finally managed to get his rifle raised, but when he pulled the trigger, nothing happened. The weapon had become as inert as a piece of decorative sculpture, its mechanical action frozen by forces beyond his comprehension. His companions discovered that their rifles had suffered the same fate. "Your tools of violence have no power." "Here," Josie explained, her voice now carrying the authority of one who speaks for forces far greater than herself. "Iron and gunpowder are powerless against the spiritual energy that flows through these sacred places. You have entered a realm where different laws apply, but I am not without mercy," she continued, her tone softening slightly. "I will give you one final opportunity to leave this place peacefully. Abandon your pursuit of the sacred elk, gather your equipment from the valley below, and never return to this region. Do this, and you will be allowed to depart with your lives, and your sanity intact." For several long minutes, the three hunters stood frozen in the midst of the supernatural manifestation Josie had called forth. The elk watched them with eyes that blazed with spiritual fire. The spectral warriors maintained their silent vigil, and the very air seemed to crackle with barely contained power. Finally, Holloway found his voice. "This is some kind of trick," he said, though his words lacked conviction. "Smoke and mirrors, trained animals, maybe gas seepage from underground that's causing hallucinations. There's got to be a rational explanation for all of this." "Believe what you need to believe," Josie replied calmly, "but make your choice. Quickly! The spiritual forces I have awakened are not infinitely patient, and my control over them is still developing. I cannot guarantee your safety much longer if you continue to threaten what is under my protection." The decision came when one of the spectral warriors began to move forward, its ghostly hand reaching toward the cruel-eyed hunter who had threatened Josie. The man let out a scream of pure terror and broke into a run toward the tree line, abandoning his useless rifle as he fled. His two companions followed quickly, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for stealth or dignity. "Wait!" Holloway called over his shoulder as he ran. "This isn't over, Mrs. Tanner. There are forces backing my operation that won't be deterred by parlor tricks and frontier superstitions. When the railroad comes through here, and it will come through, all of this wilderness and everything in it will be swept aside. Your sacred places and spirit animals won't survive progress." Josie watched the three hunters disappear into the forest, but Holloway's parting words echoed ominously in her mind. The threat he represented was just the beginning of a much larger confrontation between the forces of industrial expansion and the ancient powers that protected the sacred places. Her victory today was significant, but it was also just the first skirmish in a war that would determine the future of the entire frontier. As the spiritual manifestations gradually faded, leaving only the natural wildlife and the glowing elk as evidence of what had occurred, Ahote emerged from his concealment among the aspens. His expression was a mixture of pride and concern as he approached the spot where the confrontation had taken place. "You have proven yourself worthy of the title, Guardian," he said solemnly. "The power you displayed here today was remarkable, especially for someone so newly transformed. But Holloway was right about one thing. There are larger forces at work that will not be so easily deterred." Josie nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settling around her like a mantle. The sacred pine cone in her pouch had cooled to its normal temperature, but it continued to pulse gently, reminding her of the connection she now maintained with the spiritual network of the sacred places. The eagle feather against her skin whispered of challenges yet to come. The railroad survey team in the valley, she said. "They're just the advanced scouts for something much bigger, aren't they? The mining operations, the logging crews, the settlers who see nothing sacred in the wilderness. They're all part of a wave of destruction that's going to wash over this entire region." "Yes," Ahote confirmed grimly, "and there are other threats you haven't encountered yet. Men like Holloway work for wealthy collectors who see the sacred animals as exotic curiosities to be displayed in private zoos. Military officers who view the spiritual manifestations as potential weapons to be studied and controlled. Government agents who would eliminate anything that interferes with the expansion of American civilization." The elk approached them as they talked, his antlers still glowing faintly with residual spiritual energy. He nuzzled Josie's shoulder with obvious affection and gratitude, but she could sense deeper communication in the gesture. The sacred animal was conveying information about threats she hadn't yet detected, dangers approaching from directions she hadn't considered. Through her connection with the elk, Josie began to perceive the broader scope of the crisis facing the sacred places. Other guardians across the frontier were under similar pressure, their protected sites threatened by mining operations, railroad construction, and military expansion. Some had already fallen, their spiritual energy severed, and their sacred animals scattered or killed. "We can't face this alone," she realized aloud. "The network of guardians that White Thunder spoke of, we need to establish contact with them, coordinate our response to these threats. If we remain isolated and act independently, we'll be defeated one by one." Ahote smiled grimly. "You understand quickly what it took me years to learn. Yes, the time for solitary guardianship is ending. The forces arrayed against the sacred places are too organized and too well funded to be opposed by individual effort alone. There will be a gathering," he continued, his voice taking on the formal tone he used when conveying important tribal information. 3 days' ride north of here at the place we call the Council of Stones. Representatives from all the remaining Guardian sites will meet to plan our response to the growing threats. But first, we must secure your homestead against future intrusion. The spiritual display you created today will deter casual threats, but more determined enemies will find ways to neutralize or circumvent your defenses. You need to learn how to create permanent protective barriers, wards that will function even when you are away from the site. Josie felt a thrill of anticipation, mixed with trepidation. The transformation she had undergone at Eagle's Throne was just the beginning of her education as a guardian. There were powers and responsibilities ahead that would test her in ways she couldn't yet imagine, and allies and enemies she had yet to meet. But as she stood beside the sacred elk, with the spiritual energy of the land flowing through her like lifeblood, Josie knew she had found her true purpose. The quiet homesteader who had simply wanted to live independently on the frontier was gone forever, replaced by a guardian of forces that transcended individual desires and ambitions. The sacred places were under threat, but they were no longer defenseless. The network of guardians was awakening to meet the challenge, and Josephine Tanner would stand at the center of that awakening, wielding powers that bridged the gap between the spiritual and physical worlds. The Council of Stones revealed itself to be far more than Josie had imagined from Ahote's brief description. Hidden within a natural amphitheater carved from red sandstone, the ancient meeting place contained evidence of gatherings that stretched back centuries. Petroglyphs covered every available surface, telling stories in symbolic language that seemed to shift and change meaning depending on the angle of observation. 12 other guardians had answered the call, each representing a different sacred site across the vast frontier territory. They were a diverse group that defied every assumption Josie had held about the frontier's inhabitants. There was Maria Sandoval, a Mexican-American woman who protected a sacred spring in the desert southwest. Thomas Blackwood, a former Union Army officer who had discovered his calling at a mysterious grove in Oregon Territory. Sarah Running Bear, a half Lakota translator who guarded an ancient burial ground in the Dakota Hills. What united them? Always the same spiritual transformation Josie had experienced at Eagle's throne. Each guardian carried tokens of their calling, feathers, stones, carved totems, or crystals that pulsed with the same inner light as Josie's pine cone and eagle. Feather. More importantly, each had faced the same escalating threats from industrial expansion that were pressuring the sacred places across the region. White Thunder himself presided over the gathering, his ancient presence commanding respect from guardians who had never met him before but recognized his spiritual authority instinctively. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of prophecy and the urgency of immediate crisis. "The time of individual guardianship is ending," he announced to the circle of assembled protectors. "The forces that threaten the sacred places have grown too organized, too well-funded, and too ruthless to be opposed by solitary efforts. Railroad corporations backed by Eastern capital, mining syndicates with military support, and government agents who would eliminate anything that interferes with westward expansion. These enemies require a coordinated response. But coordination alone will not be sufficient," he continued, his weathered features grave with concern. "The spiritual energy that flows through the sacred places is weakening as more sites are destroyed or corrupted. If we lose much more of the network, the remaining nodes will not be able to sustain the connection between the physical and spirit worlds. The balance that has existed for millennia will be permanently broken." What White Thunder proposed next challenged everything the Guardians thought they understood about their individual responsibilities. Rather than simply defending their assigned sites, he suggested they attempt something that had never been tried before, a coordinated spiritual working that would strengthen the entire network simultaneously. "Each sacred place is like a single star in the sky," he explained, using gestures to illustrate the connections between distant points of light. Individually, they provide guidance and wonder, but together they form constellations that tell the great stories of creation and renewal. If we can synchronize our efforts, channel our combined spiritual energy through the network itself, we can create barriers that will protect not just individual sites, but the entire web of sacred places. The technical details of what he proposed were staggering in their complexity. Each guardian would need to return to their site and perform specific rituals at precisely coordinated times, creating a cascade of spiritual energy that would flow from node to node across hundreds of miles. The timing had to be exact, the rituals perfectly executed, and the spiritual focus maintained despite whatever physical threats might be occurring simultaneously. "The risks are considerable," White Thunder admitted candidly. "If any guardian fails in their part of the working, the spiritual backlash could destroy not just their own site, but potentially damage the entire network. We would be attempting something that has never been done before, based on theoretical understanding rather than tested practice. But if we succeed," he continued, his voice taking on a tone of profound hope, "we will create a spiritual shield that can protect the sacred places for generations to come. The industrial forces that threaten us depend on disrupting the natural harmony of the land. If that harmony becomes actively resistant to disruption, their efforts will fail regardless of their technological advantages." As the gathered guardians debated the merits and dangers of White Thunder's proposal, Josie found herself wrestling with doubts that went beyond the technical challenges involved. The great working would require her to risk not just her own life and spiritual integrity, but potentially the safety of her beloved elk and the homestead that had become her sanctuary. More troubling was the news that other guardians brought. about the escalating corporate and military pressure throughout the territory. Railroad construction was accelerating, with surveying teams pushing into previously untouched wilderness areas. Mining operations were expanding beyond precious metals to include the systematic harvesting of timber, stone, and other resources that disrupted the spiritual geography of entire regions. "They're not just building a railroad," reported James Ironfeather, who guarded a sacred canyon in Colorado Territory. "They're building an empire based on the complete transformation of the wilderness into industrial infrastructure. Every mile of track they lay, every mine they dig, every forest they clear, weakens the spiritual connections that hold our world together." Sarah Running Bear added her own disturbing intelligence about government involvement in the threats they faced. "There are agents in Washington who view our activities as potential insurrection against federal authority," she said grimly. "They're classifying the sacred sites as obstacles to national development, and the Guardians as dangerous agitators, who must be neutralized by any means necessary. Some of our number have already been arrested on trumped-up charges," she continued. "Others have simply disappeared, their sites left unprotected and quickly overrun by corporate interests. If we're going to act, it has to be soon, before there aren't enough Guardians left to make the great working possible." The debate continued. Through the night, with Guardians weighing their personal fears against their sworn responsibilities to protect the sacred places. By dawn, however, the decision had become clear. The threats they faced individually were too great to overcome through conventional resistance. The Great Working represented their only realistic chance of preserving the spiritual network for future generations. White Thunder assigned specific roles to each Guardian based on their site's position within the overall network and their individual spiritual strengths. Josie's homestead, positioned at a critical junction between mountain and prairie energy flows, would serve as one of the primary focusing nodes for the working. Her role would be among the most dangerous, requiring her to channel enormous amounts of spiritual energy while maintaining perfect concentration despite whatever physical threats might materialize. "Your elk will be crucial to the success of the working," White Thunder told her privately as the other Guardians prepared to depart for their respective sites. "His spiritual significance extends far beyond what you have yet understood. He is not just a sacred messenger, but a living embodiment of the connection between all sacred places. Through him, you will be able to tap into the full power of the network. But be warned," he added solemnly. "The forces you will channel are beyond anything you have experienced before. If your focus wavers, if your spiritual connection falters for even a moment, the energy could consume you entirely. You must be absolutely certain of your commitment before you attempt this working." Josie and Ahote returned to the homestead with less than a week to prepare for the great working. The timing had been set to coincide with the winter solstice, when the spiritual energy of the land reached its annual peak. They would have only one opportunity to succeed. Failure would likely destroy the network permanently. The first challenge was creating the physical infrastructure needed to channel the enormous spiritual energies the working would generate. Following instructions provided by White Thunder, they constructed a complex arrangement of stone circles, carved totems, and crystalline focusing arrays around the elk's resting place behind the lodge. Each element had to be positioned with mathematical precision, aligned not just with geographical features, but with stellar configurations and spiritual energy flows. More demanding was the personal preparation required for Josie to serve as the primary conduit for the working. White Thunder had provided detailed meditation techniques designed to expand her spiritual capacity, but practicing them revealed just how dangerous the attempt would be. Even minor exercises left her drained and disoriented, and the full working would require her to channel 100 times more energy. "I can feel the network responding to the preparations," she told Ahote on the evening before the solstice. "It's like touching a vast spider web that stretches across the entire continent. Every sacred site, every guardian, every spiritual creature, they're all connected by threads of energy that pulse with their own life. But I can also feel the damage," she continued, her voice heavy with sorrow. "Places where the connections have been severed, nodes where the spiritual energy has gone dark. If we don't succeed tomorrow night, those dark spots will continue spreading until the entire network collapses." The winter solstice arrived with crystalline clarity, the sky so clear and cold that the stars seemed close enough to touch. Across the frontier, 12 other guardians were making their own final preparations, synchronized to begin their parts of the working at the exact moment when the spiritual energy of the network reached its peak. Josie took her position at the center of the stone circle they had constructed, the sacred elk standing beside her with his antlers glowing like captured starlight. The pine cone from Eagle's throne pulsed with increasing intensity in her hands, and the spirit eagle's feather seemed to burn against her skin with anticipation. At precisely midnight, she began the ritual White Thunder had taught her, speaking words in a language older than human memory, while gesturing in patterns that channeled the spiritual energy flowing through the sacred site. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Power beyond anything she had experienced before began flowing through her body, connecting her not just to her own homestead, but to every other guardian performing the same ritual across hundreds of miles. Through the network connection, she could sense the other guardians beginning their own workings. Maria Sandoval channeling the desert's fierce energy through ancient petroglyphs, Thomas Blackwood drawing on the old growth forests, accumulated wisdom, Sarah Running Bear awakening the voices of ancestors buried in sacred ground. Each guardian added their strength to the growing spiritual cascade. But as the energy built toward critical levels, Josie became aware that they were not alone in the valley. Through her heightened senses, she detected the presence of armed men moving through the darkness toward her homestead. Holloway had returned with reinforcements, timing his attack to coincide with what his spies had reported as some kind of important ceremony. The approaching threat created an impossible dilemma. The great working required her complete concentration and could not be interrupted without destroying the entire network. But the armed men approaching through the darkness clearly intended to capture or kill both her and the elk, eliminating the spiritual focus that made the working possible. "I can hold them off," Ahote whispered urgently, checking his weapons, while trying not to disturb her concentration. "But there are too many of them, and they have military training. I can delay them, but not for long." The solution came from an unexpected source. As the spiritual energy of the great working reached critical intensity, the elk stepped forward and placed his magnificent antlered head directly against Josie's chest. The contact created a feedback loop that amplified both their spiritual power exponentially, but more importantly, it allowed her to maintain the working while simultaneously defending against the approaching threat. What happened next would become legend among the frontier settlements for generations to come. The combined spiritual power of Josie, the elk, and the entire network of sacred places manifested as an aurora-like display that filled the entire sky with shifting colors and impossible geometries. The light was visible for hundreds of miles, and its spiritual impact was felt by every living creature across the Western Territories. More immediately, the display had a devastating effect on Holloway and his hired gunmen. The spiritual energy was so intense that their weapons became too hot to hold. Their compasses spun wildly, and their horses bolted in terror. Several of the men collapsed unconsciously, overwhelmed by exposure to forces their minds could not process. But the true miracle of the Great Working was what it accomplished across the entire network of sacred places. At each guardian site, the coordinated spiritual energy created protective barriers that were not just strong, but actively resistant to disruption. Railroad survey equipment malfunctioned when brought near sacred ground. Mining operations discovered that their machinery would not function in areas protected by the network. Military units found their weapons and vehicles inexplicably failing when they attempted to enter spiritual territories. As dawn broke over the valley, Josie found herself transformed once again, but this time the change was not individual, but collective. The Great Working had succeeded beyond White Thunder's most optimistic hopes, creating a spiritual shield that protected not just the existing sacred places, but actively encouraged the restoration of sites that had been damaged or destroyed. The elk, his role in the working completed, began to show signs that his time on the physical plane was ending. His form became increasingly translucent as the morning light grew stronger, and his eyes held the depth of someone preparing for a journey to realms beyond ordinary perception. He was never meant to stay here permanently, Ahote explained, gently as they watched the magnificent creature begin his final transformation. His purpose was to guide you to your calling and serve as the spiritual focus for the Great Working. Now that both tasks are completed, he returns to the realm of the spirits, but the connection you forged will remain forever. As the elk's physical form dissolved into points of light that rose toward the sky like inverted stars, Josie felt not loss, but fulfillment. The wounded animal she had helped heal behind her lodge had been the catalyst for a transformation that protected sacred places across the entire frontier. Her act of simple kindness had cascaded into consequences that would preserve the spiritual balance of the Western Territories for generations to come. In the weeks that followed the Great Working, Josie discovered that her role as a guardian had evolved far beyond protecting a single sacred site. The network's enhanced power had made her a coordinator and teacher for newly awakening guardians across the expanding frontier. People with spiritual sensitivity were drawn to the protected areas, seeking understanding of the forces they sensed but could not name. Settlers began arriving who were different from the exploitative pioneers the railroad corporations had sent before. These were individuals who recognized the spiritual significance of the land and sought to build communities that worked in harmony with the sacred places rather than destroying them. They came seeking guidance from the guardians about how to live sustainably on land that was alive with spiritual energy. The balance has shifted, Ahote observed, as they watched a group of new settlers respectfully establishing their homesteads. At the approved distance from the sacred grove, the forces of exploitation and destruction have not been eliminated, but they no longer have unlimited power to reshape the wilderness according to their will. The spiritual resistance you helped create gives people a choice. They can work with the land's inherent nature, or they can find their efforts consistently frustrated by forces beyond their understanding. The eagle feathers that had first marked Josie as worthy of spiritual calling now served a different purpose. She used them to bless new guardians and to establish communication links between distant sacred sites. The network that had been created through the Great Working continued to grow stronger as more people accepted their calling to serve as bridges between the physical and spiritual worlds. Years later, when travelers told stories of the mysterious events that had preserved the western wilderness from complete industrial exploitation, they often spoke of a frontier woman who had given water to a wounded elk and received in return the power to protect entire territories from destruction. The details varied with each telling, but the essential truth remained constant. Kindness toward the sacred had been rewarded with the ability to preserve what was sacred. Josie's homestead, became a pilgrimage site for those seeking to understand their own spiritual connection to the land. She welcomed visitors, but always insisted that the real lesson was not in the dramatic events of the Great Working, but in the simple decision to help a suffering creature without expecting anything in return. The power to change the world often begins with the choice to care for what is right in front of you, she would tell those who came seeking wisdom. I didn't set out to become a guardian of sacred places or to lead a spiritual resistance against industrial exploitation. I just couldn't walk away from an animal that needed help. But that decision connected me to forces and purposes larger than anything I could have imagined when I first came to this frontier seeking solitude and independence. The elk that appeared behind my lodge was not just seeking healing for his wounds, but offering me the chance to heal the wounds being inflicted on the land itself. The 3 eagle feathers that had marked the beginning of her transformation were eventually given to 3 new guardians who would carry the work forward into the next generation. But the spiritual network they had helped create continued to grow and strengthen, ensuring that the sacred places would have protectors for as long as there were people willing to listen to the voices that spoke from stone and stream, from ancient trees and open sky. And sometimes, in the early morning light, when the mist rose from the valleys and the spiritual energy of the land was most active, visitors to the homestead reported seeing a magnificent elk standing beside the old lodge, his antlers glowing with starlight as he watched over the sacred places that his sacrifice had helped preserve. Whether vision or reality, his presence reminded all who saw him that some gifts, once given freely, create connections that transcend the boundaries between worlds and endure far beyond the lives of those who offered them. The frontier had been forever changed by a woman who chose compassion over convenience, and the sacred places would remember her choice for as long as the mountains stood and the waters flowed toward the sea. In the end, Josephine Tanner had discovered that the greatest adventure was not in conquering the wilderness, but in learning to serve something greater than herself and finding, in that service, a purpose that transformed not just her own life, but the destiny of the land itself. The autumn of 1889 found Josie standing on the same ridge where she had first observed the railroad surveyor's camp 5 years earlier, but the valley below bore little resemblance to what those men had planned to create. Instead of scarred earth and industrial infrastructure, the landscape flourished with a vitality that seemed to grow stronger each passing season. 2 small communities had established themselves within the spiritually protected territory, their buildings constructed from local stone and timber, harvested only with the permission of the Guardian Network. The railroad had indeed come to the region, but its route curved respectfully around the sacred sites, following a path that added nearly 50 miles to the journey, but avoided disrupting the spiritual energy flows that the Great Working had made manifest. Hard to believe it's only been 5 years, Ahote commented as he joined her on the ridge, his weathered features showing the satisfaction of someone who had lived to see his deepest hopes fulfilled. Sometimes it feels like we've been guardians for decades, and sometimes it seems like yesterday that you were just a lonely homesteader trying to save a wounded elk. Josie smiled, her hand unconsciously moving to touch the small medicine pouch she now wore at her throat, containing the sacred pine cone and the eagle feather that had marked her transformation. "The lonely homesteader part wasn't wrong," she replied. "I just didn't understand what I was lonely for. I thought I wanted solitude, but what I really needed was purpose." The success of the Great Working had attracted others with spiritual sensitivity to the protected territories, and Josie had spent much of the past 5 years training new guardians in the skills and knowledge necessary to maintain the network. Her most promising student was Rebecca Chen, a Chinese-American woman whose family had fled violence in California mining camps. Under Josie's guidance, she had bonded with a golden eagle and was preparing to establish her own guardian site in the northern mountains. The network grows stronger with each new guardian, Josie explained to a group of visitors who had come, seeking understanding of the forces that protected the valley. Each person who accepts the calling adds their strength to the whole, and the sacred places respond by revealing new aspects of their power and wisdom. 3 months earlier, on the anniversary of the Great Working, something extraordinary had occurred. As Josie was conducting her evening meditation beside the stone circle behind her lodge, a familiar presence had made itself known. The elk appeared not in physical form, but as a manifestation of pure spiritual energy visible only to those with guardian sight. He was more magnificent than ever, his antlers now wreathed in aurora-like light that shifted through every color of the spectrum. Through their renewed connection, the elk conveyed visions of other sacred sites across the continent where guardian networks were beginning to form. "He's not just our elk anymore," Josie told Ahote after the vision ended. "He's become something like a spiritual ambassador, traveling between different guardian networks and helping coordinate their efforts. The wounded animal I helped heal behind my lodge has become a bridge between all the sacred places on the continent." The success of the Guardian Network had not eliminated all threats to the sacred places, but it had fundamentally changed the nature of the struggle. Corporate interests still pressed for access to the protected territories, but they now faced organized opposition from the growing number of people who understood the value of preserving wilderness areas. More significantly, a new generation of settlers was arriving, who had been drawn specifically by stories of the guardian networks and the promise of living in harmony with spiritual forces. These newcomers brought complementary skills: doctors who understood spiritually active plants, engineers who could design buildings that enhanced rather than disrupted energy flows, teachers who helped children develop sensitivity to the natural world. "The balance has shifted permanently," Ahote observed as they watched the sun set over the thriving valley. "Not completely. There are still those who see the wilderness only as resources to be exploited. But now there are also those who understand that some things are too precious to be bought or sold." As darkness settled over the valley and the first stars appeared, Josie felt the familiar pulse of spiritual energy that connected her to Guardian sites across vast distances. Through the network, she could sense other guardians conducting their own evening meditations, each adding their strength to the web of protection that now stretched across thousands of square miles of preserved wilderness. "Duda, you ever regret the choice you made?" Rebecca Chen asked, as the newest guardian joined them on the ridge. "The quiet life you gave up when you decided to help the elk?" Josie considered the question seriously, thinking back to the lonely existence she had built before that September morning when everything changed. "I thought I wanted solitude," she said finally, "but what I really wanted was to matter, to be part of something larger and more meaningful than just my own survival and comfort. The elk gave me that chance, and in return, I've received far more than I ever could have imagined. Not just the power to protect the sacred places, but the knowledge that my life has purpose that will continue long after I'm gone. The children growing up in these protected valleys will never know a world where the spiritual and physical realms are completely separated," she continued, her voice filled with quiet satisfaction. "They'll grow up understanding that they are part of a living web of connection that includes not just other humans, but all the creatures and plants and stones and waters that share this land. That's a legacy worth any sacrifice we've faced." The wounded elk behind my lodge wasn't just seeking healing for himself. He was offering healing for the wounded relationship between humanity and the natural world. And that healing is still happening, growing stronger every day. As the Guardian Network pulsed with the combined spiritual energy of dozens of protectors across the frontier, Josie felt the presence of the elk one more time, his essence flowing through the connections between sacred sites like light through a vast web of crystal. The simple act of giving water to a suffering creature had grown into something that would preserve the spiritual heart of the wilderness for generations yet to come. The stars wheeled overhead in their eternal patterns, but now they looked down on a land where the ancient balance between worlds had been restored and would be maintained by those who understood that some gifts, once freely given, create connections that transcend the boundaries of time and space itself. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.